Hi, I'm Fran Maier, and welcome to another Napa Institute podcast. As American culture changes and becomes less supportive of religious belief, religious believers increasingly face questions about their duties to the nation and what the virtue of patriotism actually requires of them. And that's our topic today. Russell R. Reno, more commonly known as Rusty, is the editor-in-chief of First Things magazine and general editor of the multi-volume Brazos Theological Commentary on the Bible. A graduate of Haverford College and Yale University, where he earned his doctorate, he taught for 20 years at Jesuit-run Creighton University in Omaha before switching full-time to journalism based in Manhattan. He's also the author of too many articles and public talks to count, and books that include Resurrecting the Idea of a Christian Society, Fighting the Noonday Devil, Heroism and the Idea of a Christian Society, and most recently, The Return of the Strong Gods, Nationalism, Populism, and the Future of the West, published by Regnery in 2019. Rusty, thanks for being with us today.
Great to be with you.
Okay, so, Rusty, I really want to talk mainly about the virtue of patriotism and how religiously faithful people should live it in this increasingly ambiguous time for our country. But first, a little bit about your background. You were raised in the Episcopal tradition. So how and why did you end up Catholic?
Well, I kind of collapsed into Catholicism in the mid-aughts after being involved in the National Episcopal Church and various committees. And I became so really angry about the capitulation to the sexual revolution that was, it wasn't like it was beginning then, it was more like it was being completed. Mm-hmm. And, you can't base your spiritual life on anger. And so I kind of I've always thought of Catholicism, the Church of Rome, as the prime substance of Christianity in the West. And so people say, why did you choose Catholicism? I don't think of it that way. I think more that like I said, I kind of defaulted to the Church of Rome. It's just what Newman said about the Church of Rome is that it preoccupies the ground. So I'm kind of stuck with the basic form of Christianity in Western civilization. Mm-hmm. And it's been better than I thought it would be. I mean, after all, I taught at a Jesuit school, so I had no illusions whatsoever about the church. It was in the aftermath of the breaking of the clerical abuse crisis in Boston. And people said, were you disappointed? I said, oh, no. I had very low expectations. All have been exceeded.
That's a good Catholic attitude. You have an interesting personal story and a particular respect for Judaism and a nearness to the Jewish faith and tradition. Would you mind talking about that for just a moment before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, it's just the happenstance of life. The woman that I met in grad school who I wound up marrying is Jewish. And so this precipitated a close engagement with Judaism. I went to synagogue and learned a lot more about it. And then really the breakthrough or the point at which I really got excited about the relation between Christianity and Judaism was reading Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik's book, Halakhic Man, which has, for those who are, have read a lot of theology, it's got a lot of kind of crypto-Christological stuff in it. And it really made me realize that Judaism is a mirror in which Christians can see themselves more clearly. Also their failures, they can see more clearly. Judaism is it claims territory. It claims aspects of life. When my kids were small, my wife kept separate dishes for milk meals and meat meals. And so every day setting the table for dinner, the children had to say, well, Mom, is it a meat meal or a milk meal? Mm-hmm. And so it ensured that there was a religious, if you will, invasion of the dinner table, and of course grace too, but that kind of hands-on religiosity is something that Catholics, of course we know that in our own tradition, the corporal works of mercy are hands-on activities, so to speak. But Judaism does it in a particularly systematic way that I think we can learn from.
Yeah. So how you met your wife, Juliana, in at Yale. How do you end up in Omaha as a Yale-educated theologian teaching on a Catholic university faculty?
Well, it's very interesting that Creighton, thank God, Creighton was looking for a married male Protestant to teach. They were actually, I was an affirmative action hire.
Mm-hmm.
That when I arrived at Creighton in 1990, there were no non-Catholics on the faculty, and there was nobody on the faculty of theology who was not either a priest, a nun, or a laicized priest. So I was the first and I came in with two other people, and the three of us were the first people to come into the department who were not kind of clericalized in one fashion or another. And they did not want to hire a single Protestant male either, because of their anxieties about young male faculty and students.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just 1990, and it was the only job offer I got, and we went to Omaha. It's really my wife. I mean, she's a really East Coast person, and but she's an adventurous, so she just took it all in stride, and we grew. We were there for 20 plus years, and really grew to love Omaha. And I have a warm. The church in Omaha, for instance, is really very, just very sane, and that's what I was saying about how my expectations were exceeded, and part of it was parish life in Omaha was quite rich, and the music program at the cathedral where I was a member, was superb. And people would say, "Oh, you must miss the good music from the Episcopal Church." And I go, "You have no idea how lucky I am in the Catholic Church."
Well, it's a huge endorsement of your professional skill being hired. I can say that. It just seems to be providential. But it does give us the opportunity to talk about the state of Catholic education, higher education, very briefly. I mean, coming off of that 20 years of teaching at a Catholic higher ed institution, I mean, what are your impressions of the health of Catholic higher ed?
It's not in good shape. How to diagnose the problems is really actually quite complex. Mm-hmm. I would say that the greatest challenge to Catholic higher education is the collapse of religious orders that provided those institutions with the ballast that, my own department, the lay faculty, the clerical faculty, the Jesuits, at the end of the day, were very concerned about how our decisions would affect the church. And their loyalty was to the church and not to the academia. And lay faculty tend to be loyal to academia first, church second.
Right.
And that drift of the Catholic education towards basically being just an echo of secular higher ed is what is the essential problem. Now, I should say, however, that things are actually accomplished in Catholic higher ed. Both of my kids went to Jesuit schools, my daughter to Loyola Chicago and my son to Seattle University. And you cannot graduate from those schools and think that only stupid people are religious. Mm-hmm. And that is really important in 2020 America, when our elite who run our country often have no contact with a living religious tradition. And so I think there are many things we need to do to try to reform Catholic higher education and recover a stronger sense of Catholic identity, greater loyalty to the magisterium, more confidence in our own voice as Catholics. But at the same time, we should recognize that even these very imperfect institutions do some significant good.
Yeah, you were you were a full tenured professor.
Yes.
when you left. It had to be a tremendous change. Number one, change of career, but what was it about First Things that made you make that kind of a real, life-changing decision to move first of all from Omaha to Manhattan, and then also to completely leave behind the higher ed career that you had built methodically over 20 years and become an editor? I mean, why
I
did you
think
do it?
no, I think I was always a generalist when it came to academic work. Um, I don't have the scholar's gene, that lets you sit at your desk day in and day out and really have this deep expertise in one area. I would get bored with certain topics and move on. I wrote about patristic exegesis. I wrote about contemporary affairs. I wrote about all these, heroism in the Christian life.
Mhm.
So I think going to First Things was actually was not a big change. I was writing for the magazine already,
Yes.
um, and it suited my intellectual habits, which were, um, you know, I would like to thinking deeply about things, but moving on. And magazines are, it's a monthly magazine. And so, you fill the bathtub up, the brain, and you think about things, and then you pull the plug, and you could basically a year later, you can't even remember that you wrote it, much less all the reading you did to be able to write it.
Yeah.
I've always been like that. And so I think I'm well suited for this vocation, probably even better than as a scholar.
Yeah. Yeah. Rusty, a lot of people think that First Things, or they assume that First Things is a Catholic publication. And of course, a lot of Catholics write for it, and you yourself are Catholic, and some of your staff is. But that's never really been what it is. It's never been intended to be a Catholic magazine. It's not a Catholic magazine. It's got a focus on the intersection of religious belief and the public square. So when you sit down to talk, when you sit down to talk with your staff about what's going to be in the next issue, for example, I mean, what goes through your head? How do you reason about that? And how does the strategy of the magazine differ uh, from the other religious magazines out there?
We are not registered in the Catholic registry of Catholic entities that foundations can give to that have that as their focus. Much to my dismay, when I'm fundraising on occasion, uh, uh, and so you're quite correct. We're very Catholic influenced, but Newhouse, Richard John Newhouse, when he founded the magazine, was a Lutheran. He became a Catholic a year later, and then was ordained to the priesthood, and yet another year later. So, but the magazine always wanted to be a place where religiously minded folks can speak their minds about the pressing uh, political and cultural issues of our time. And the assumption is that in this crazy quilt pluralistic society like ours, that the that religiosity is a leaven in public sphere. And people make fun of Dwight Eisenhower. He said the foundation of our country is religious, and I don't care which one it is. People mock that, but there's an element of realism in that, with a realization that having a transcendent orientation is what frees you from political ideology and the temptation of political ideology in that bad sense, but also instills a sense of duty and responsibility to the public realm. And so that combination, I think, is in a very simple way the kind of fundamental contribution that religious people can make to American public life. And then we can add on to that specific things our different traditions emphasize. The Protestants, they're just really good at the freedom stuff. You know, we had a piece by Al Mohler about why I'm a Baptist. It's just that cussed independent streak that I love about the American personality. I share some of it. Catholics and Jews, by contrast, have a very rich formation and tradition of thinking about the common good and communal sense of communal responsibility. So that's a wonderful combination. That cussed, individualistic, spirited mentality of independence combined with very rich vocabulary and language about the common good and collective responsibility.
Yeah, I would add to what you just said, by the way, and your own experience in your family is a pretty good example of this. I think Judaism and Christianity also have an extremely healthy anthropology, not a conception of humanity that is really powerful, and that's something that when I go back and read Hebrew scripture, I mean, it's something that I find a real indebtedness to Judaism and my own Christianity for that reason. I mean, a sense of self-criticism that otherwise you would never see in so many other institutions. That there's and paths of belief. I mean, there's a constant willingness to indict oneself and examine oneself that Christianity inherited, and of course that's a powerful motive for repentance in the Catholic faith as well.
Well, I think the sense of humility that comes from
But
contrition
yeah,
and repentance, and also the tragic sense of life,
yes,
the reality of sin, which affects us all. And that in the current political climate of, one of the things about political correctness is that it has a very vivid sense of evil, but there's no forgiveness whatsoever. And so it's a really highly punitive way of thinking about civic life.
yeah.
And I agree with you. I think that's an important contribution we can make.
You know, I think there's a common tendency to assume that the country's been drifting away from religious belief since the sexual revolution. But really, you've made the point in some of your writing and in some of our private conversations that that drift began well before the sexual revolution. American culture and institutions have become increasingly negative toward religious belief. In broad terms, how do you explain that?
Yeah, well, we have Weber's notion of the disenchantment of the world. This is a formulation he used around the time of World War I. Now, for Weber, this was a burden that modern men and women had to carry, that the world is not infused with divine purpose. What happened, though, after World War II and the interpretation of World War II and the Holocaust was that this stems from overbelief. People believe too passionately. And so after 1945, this notion of disenchantment, instead of being something that we need to temper in our society, it actually becomes affirmed as the way to build a more peaceful, affirming, and inclusive society. So really, after 1945, I think our educational culture increasingly embraces what I would call a small, impoverished view of the human person, not as what science tells us, although it sometimes can be interpreted that way, but rather as a positive pedagogy for young people. If nothing is worth fighting for, then no one will fight. That's the basic premise of this worldview.
It's a pretty
If nothing is worth judging other people on, then no one will be judged. And so the relativism, the small view, the utilitarianism, all of this stuff it flows from a desire to create a conflict-free, peaceful world. And I think that contributes strongly to the secularization of our society.
yeah. You know,
Not an inevitable consequence of science, for instance. I think it's just false.
yeah. Based on what you just said, let me read a list that I made here before the interview. We're a country that now has allowed the killing of 50 million unborn children, applauds same-sex marriage and transgenderism, increasingly tolerates physician-assisted suicide, and in the middle of a pandemic, allows abortion clinics and liquor stores to operate while it shuts down or greatly restricts religious worship. It's reasonable to ask, why would any religious believer of real conviction risk his or her life defending that kind of society?
Well, we have to beware creating our own version of the 1619 project,
Mhm.
where we look only at the sins of our fellow citizens and not their virtues. And so, yes, these are terrible blemishes on our civic life. These are evils that are very much with us. I think people will look back at the abortion regime with the same embarrassment and horror that we look back on the slave empire of the South um, in our own history. But I think that one of the great virtues of our society is that it is ordered towards self-government, and so we do have the power with enough organization effort. We have the power to remedy some of these problems. We are citizens, not subjects. That we are both not just have legal freedoms, but we have a culture of freedom that encourages us to actually face these evils.
Well, and based on what you're saying, how should we think? How should a Christian or practicing Jew think about the obligations of patriotism? I mean, what do we owe our homeland, and what don't we owe our homeland?
Well, I think you have it's a patrimony. Our homeland is a patrimony, and so you have it follows in the same natural. We have the same natural duty. It follows from the commandment to honor your mother and father, to honor your homeland, your fatherland. But for this country, I would not have a home. I would not be from anywhere. Now, we all know that we could have been born in Hungary or in China, right? And just as, but, and so in that sense, our family is more fundamental than nation, because it's very hard to think of myself as being born to different parents, because then I'd be just different. But in our cosmopolitan age, we can imagine being born and raised in a different country. But nevertheless, when I look back at age 60, I cannot disentangle myself from my Americanness. And so I think that we have a duty. I mean, we're coming up on Thanksgiving, and it's a time of giving. It's a time of expressing gratitude. Gratitude for the gift of life, really, I think actually is what Thanksgiving's about for the pilgrims who survived that first winter, that first year. And I think similarly, we have a debt of gratitude to our parents, even if they're very imperfect. And we have a debt of gratitude to our homeland for giving us a legacy, a heritage, an identity. And that's not a blank check, right? It's clear that people who are abused by their parents can often decide that, no, I need to leave and cut off my ties. And the same is true with the nation. The nation can become perverse and destructive and harmful. I remember reading Notes of a Native Son, by James Baldwin when I was in Europe as a student, summer abroad thing. And his introduction is anguished as he realizes that even though he hates America, he cannot escape it because he is American. He hates it for its racism and for its treatment of him, but he cannot help but love it because it's his homeland. And it's a beautiful passage, actually. Very affected me when I was 20 years old. And so those are natural duties that we have. And obviously those natural duties are always trumped by our supernatural duty to God. And which often overrides our duty to our parents. I think when men enter religion, or men and women enter religious life and take a vow of celibacy, in some sense they are repudiating their natural duty to provide their parents with grandchildren. And of course, for faithful Catholics, that's a blessing because this higher vocation is to be honored. And the same thing's true, obviously, for us as Catholics and Christians here in America, that there are perverse things that this nation there's paths down which this nation may go that will make it impossible for us to support the country. I don't think we're there yet, but that's always a possibility that we could go down that path.
Rusty, you used the word cosmopolitan a moment ago, and I want to build on that. There's a huge emphasis these days on a push for things that indicate that drift in the direction of global unity, global cooperation. There's talk of a great reset um, for global and economic justice. It's hard to criticize the idealism behind that because it has a kind of a Christian resonance. And in fact, it's shared by a number of senior Christian and other religious leaders. Um, what, if anything, is wrong with that kind of globalist thinking? And why is the existence of the nation still so important?
Yeah, I was at a conference a couple of years ago, and I think it was Steve Long gave a very fine paper on the common concept of the common good. He teaches at Ave Maria, very, a very astute theologian. And I asked him, is there such a thing as a global common good? I mean, there are global utilities, but utilities are not common goods.
Mhm.
I mean, GDP is not a common good. Common goods are things that we honor for their own sake. And the negative piece of absence of conflict is not a common good in that sense. By contrast, and our shared humanity is that anyway. I don't want to go on too long on that, but it's not clear to me you can have a global political life because political life is when people unite to promote common goods. And if you're Hungarian, one of the most vivid common good is the survival of your language or the preservation of your literature and your poetry. We English speakers take all that for granted because our language is in a kind of piranha mode globally. And but other common goods are passing on to our children family heritage, civic heritage, and so on. So it's not clear to me you can have a global political life. And so this globalist thinking strikes me as leading us towards a future that's technocratic rather than political. And what I mean by that is that instead of being organized around civic goods, it's going to be organized around maximizing utility for everybody in the world. And that will have the effect of encouraging us to become, to your point earlier on, this much lower anthropology, where what it means to be human is to have stuff and not die. Which is the pandemic, right? I mean,
Right.
I mean, I'm not opposed to public health measures. I mean, public health measures are sometimes needed, but it's never the case that not dying is the highest good.
Yeah, Leon Kass makes that point in a number of his essays in a really powerful way.
And so, in a globalized, global governance would be ordered towards what? Okay, so we fight global warming. Well, you could say global warming is a negative utility. We want to minimize negative utilities, and we want to maximize positive utilities, economic growth. And warfare is a negative utility because it's destructive. We want to eliminate that. But again, I kind of work through these things. You could say that sharing a sense of unity with your fellow man is a good, an intrinsic good. But it becomes harder and harder to we have a hard enough time doing it with 330 million people in this country. I mean, a 6 billion person civic entity strikes me as just a fantasy. And the globalism is really inclining towards a global oligarchy that really takes on responsibility for governance and leaves the 6 billion residents of the globe as kind of passive recipients of their benevolent governance.
Yeah, it is sort of a maturation of the whole technocratic mindset in a way that.
I'm not hostile to international institutions. I mean, obviously there are these negative utilities that need to be addressed, but I'm very skeptical of the utopianism that often associated with it. These kinds of institutions and our expectations should be extremely pragmatic, and they should be oriented towards solving particular problems. I mean, I'm a fan of the language for the European Union, which is a community of nations, not a community that transcends nations. because I think it's just intrinsic to the human person to want to have a sense of belonging that is somehow tied to place and history and heritage. People say, "Oh, Rusty, you're being a blood and soil nationalist," and well, I'll dismiss the blood side, but there's nothing wrong with a little bit of soil nationalism. Why? I mean, I love our country physically. I think it's a beautiful place. I've hitchhiked across the country half a dozen times as a teenager and driven across the country so many times I can't even count. And it always, why shouldn't we have a strong sense of place? That's a very good thing. And when people talk about blood, they often talk about really language, I think, for a lot of countries, European countries. Language is the entry point of belonging. And Roger Scruton was always very good on this, which is that we want to belong to a place where we are accepted, even if we're kind of lousy, you know, even if we're failures, even if we don't have to earn our place in this community. It's just, we belong.
Yes.
And I think that obviously family get together with Thanksgiving. That's part of what makes family so precious to people, is that they're stuck with us, you know, and that's a kind of a reassurance in our highly super competitive world that many of us live in. And the same thing is true with nation. I just don't see how humanity as a category could provide that same kind of particularized belonging. You know, the place when you go and you know the slang, you can read the body language, and you say, I don't have to. I belong here, as opposed to a place I have to work to fit into.
Rusty, we've got about 2 minutes, and I want to ask you very quickly. We have a regime coming in January, the Biden administration, that is a very eccentric way of looking at the Catholic faith and public policy. What do ordinary Catholics do to digest that and live authentically in a government that seems to be fundamentally hypocritical in some ways? I mean, what gives you hope in that kind of an environment?
Yeah, I think, right. It's kind of an analogy, isn't it, to Catholic higher ed? I mean, some of the most demoralized, it's one thing to go to, State U and have it be teaching you these anti-Catholic things. It's very demoralizing to go to to DePaul University or something like that and get anti-Catholic stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the same thing's going to be the case with President Biden. That it's going to be demoralizing if he tries to justify these very anti-magisterial positions directly contrary as somehow consistent with the Catholic faith. So I'm hoping that our church leaders can speak firmly, calmly but firmly, to correct this erroneous impression.
I wouldn't put too much money on that, Rusty, but what gives you hope in this kind of environment?
It's back to earlier in our conversation that it was just recently the Christ the King, and he really is the one who will sort this out at the end of history, and so it's not incumbent upon us to solve all the problems, and so that my hope is in him. My hope is not a hope that somehow 10 years from now I'm going to get my way. That's not a realistic hope.
Yeah.
But the hope that we have in his final victory, I think, gives us the kind of calm, strength of purpose, but a kind of calm that would allow us to, I think, be restorers of the repairing of the civic fabric, even as we fight for what we think is best for our country.
Rusty, this has been a great conversation. I'm very grateful. Thanks for the time.
All right, thanks. Thanks for having me.
God bless.
All right, thanks.